If you look, climate change is a global problem, and so the same issues arise for the global community. But a distinctive feature of the global community is you don't have global government. And so it's a different situation. It's much more a bargaining decision. And in a sense, the key issue is how to allocate emissions among countries. That is, how to allocate emission reduction. So how much? So given an overall global level of emission reduction, how to allocate it among countries, and also maybe countries make side payments, pay compensation or whatever. So in addition to a developed country taking on an emission reduction target, it might have to do something else, whether it's literally pay money or provide assistance, technology transfer or whatever. So I'm distinguishing the extra issues which arise in international climate policy from those in domestic policy, because I'm talking today only about domestic policy. So I'm not going to touch this at all. Also, what I haven't listed here is adaptation policy, what actions should be taken by the government to promote adaptation. And I'm not addressing them. So I'm just going to address domestic climate policy narrowly. But I'm afraid I'll fill up the time doing that. So let me start off by saying pollution is an externality to an economist, just like discharging carbon monoxide or SO2 or something else into the air, or just like discharging BOD or mercury or whatever into a waterway. That is, it's an externality, namely where somebody takes an action which imposes external costs on other people, and the person taking the action disregards the external costs because they don't accrue to him. And so the private calculus is just based on a consideration of the benefits and costs to the actor and disregards the externalities, the social costs, or social benefits that accrue to other people. And the example is the railroad. The railroad company decides how to operate the railroad, but in those days with coal to generate steam, sparks, burning embers would fall by the wayside and create fires on the neighboring land. And the argument was that the railroad company would disregard that because that wasn't its problem, that wasn't its property. So the key point is an externality arises whenever there's a divergence between the benefit or cost to the person that takes the action and other parties. And Pigou argued that in the presence of externalities, a market outcome is not in the public interest. There is, as we now say, a market failure, and some government intervention is required. The reason I'm saying this is greenhouse gases are not like, say, secondhand smoke, where if I burn fossil fuel in my car or use electricity for my computer, I don't create sort of an impact on you in the same way if I smoked a cigarette in your face. But nevertheless, I do affect you, or I affect other people, not necessarily other people in Berkeley, California, in 2008, but other people at other parts of the world and at other points in time in the future because of the effect of fossil fuel on the global concentrations and of greenhouse gases and the effect of those on temperature and precipitation and ozone and other things. So the point is, to an economist, the fact that I don't have a physical tie to the victim, I don't hit you or, as I say, blow smoke in your face, is irrelevant. I'm causing an impact on you. And so from this point of view, greenhouse gases fit into a toolkit which is 90 years old. Pigou's book came out in 1918 or so. And so you could say we've known how to handle this for a long time. And Pigou identified two generic remedies. The government could regulate the private action, ban or limit the activities that cause harmful externalities, or alternatively impose a tax that is allowed the activity to proceed, but imposed a charge and a tax, and that would pick up the damage imposed on other people than the actor himself. And so it would internalize the damage to other people that the actor is causing, because he now has to pay the tax on his action. The more of the action, the more the tax. And so he's then motivated to take into account appropriately the interests of other people. So those two generic approaches, regulating the action or taxing it, right, were what Pigou proposed. Now, Pigou discussed this in 19. Environmental policy, as you know, sort of gets going in the modern form around late 1960s, 1970. And both of Pigou's approaches have been applied, but in a variety of forms. So I list, for example, instead of a limit on emissions, some people have talked about an intensity standard, a limit on emissions per unit of output. That, of course, is not a limit on emissions, it's a limit on intensity. And so if the level of emissions matters rather than the intensity, then at best that's a second best way of trying to get at things. Likewise, instead... well, it's... it has come up from time to time in the last 8 years. But the other, pragmatic issues arise. And so, for example, it may be easier to tax an input. For example, to tax the use of energy rather than to tax CO2 emissions. Or to tax the amount of electricity or the amount of cement rather than the CO2 emissions. I'm calling those indirect or second best approaches. Those are not the same as taxing the emissions, and they don't therefore work as well. And the other sort of indirect approach is mandating the use of a particular abatement technology or a particular production technology, which is chosen to limit emissions. That may be more like an intensity standard, in that it limits the emissions per unit output rather than the absolute levels of the emissions. So my point is the regulation, regulations have taken a variety of forms. So I just want to emphasize that. And likewise, with taxes, they've taken a variety of forms, because, again, rather than taxing the emission itself, one might tax something correlated in some manner with the emission, like the tax on the use of input, tax on output, a tax on the cement produced, or so on. So the actual instruments, again, are less pure than the two Pigou identified. And then cap and trade is something that was first proposed actually about 40 years ago by economists, and I'll elaborate on that, and it's sort of a mix of a regulation and a tax, and I'll explain the mix later. So I want to make observations in general. I'll get to greenhouse gases in 10 minutes or so, but I want to make some general observations on the sort of relating to standards and taxes and cap and trade for pollutants. And one point is, because a commodity, say fuel, is an input to the production or use of commodities. For example, it's an input to the production of cement, or it's an input to driving a car. You put a tax on fuel, that in turn will raise the price of cement or the price of driving, the cost to the owner. And so making cement may be what triggers, causes the greenhouse gases, or driving a car. The tax may not be on the CO2, or rather, even if the tax is on the CO2, it can be carried forward in the economy and make activities which embody the pollutant more expensive, and thereby reducing their demand, and thereby increasing the supply of substitutes that don't embody the pollutant in the same way. So the notion is that the price effects radiate out through the economy. The price is imposed, the tax is imposed at a certain point, and I'm going to come back to this theme several times, but it generates price signals which radiate out through the economy in some way and influence behavior. And so a couple of points. If the source of the emissions, the location of the emissions, doesn't matter, so that the only thing that does matter is the total level of emissions, then the simple goal is to reduce the total level of emissions at the lowest cost. Now, for many pollutants, it does make a difference. For example, the air blows in a particular direction, so if you generate SO2 or something in LA, it affects the winds blow to the northeast, and it affects places northeast of LA, but not places west of LA or south or northwest. In that case, the damage depends on the location of the emission. Greenhouse gases are pretty unique in that the effects, their effects are independent of where on the surface of the Earth the emission, where the greenhouse gases are released. They, to use the term of art, they're perfectly mixed. Now, if you want to minimize the aggregate cost of an aggregate level of emission, it's an elementary principle of economics that you accomplish this by cutting back on each source up to the point where the marginal cost of abatement of each source is equalized. And that means, for example, a uniform tax of $10 a ton or whatever will bring about, other things equal, an equalization of marginal cost, because everybody who pays the tax has an incentive to abate up to the point where the marginal cost of abatement equals $10. If the marginal cost of abatement is higher than $10, then you may as well stop, because it's cheaper to pay the tax and not to abate. So if everybody faces the same tax and each person equalizes his marginal cost of abatement to the tax he faces, then they equalize the cost of marginal cost of abatement among themselves. Yes.
The tax is on emissions, which would also be emission precursors.
To the extent there's the cleanest case is there's a perfect one-to-one link between precursor or whatever it is and the emission. So it makes no difference whether you do the precursor or the emission, because you get exactly. I mean, it may be there's 2 units of emission for every 1 unit of precursor, but there's an absolutely fixed link. To the extent there's not a fixed link, there's a whole literature on indirect taxes or indirect standards versus direct taxes or direct standards, and it muddles things up. But so I'm assuming it's a direct tax or something that's perfectly equivalent to a direct tax. So the point made here is, if firms have different abatement costs, having everybody reduce emissions 10%, say, may not be efficient, because it may be much cheaper for people on the East Coast to reduce emissions than people on the West Coast. And so you'd lower the cost if you had the people who could do it more cheaply do more, and the people who could do it less cheaply do less, than if you make everybody do the same. So if there are differences in the cost of abatement, equalizing the amount of abatement may seem fair, but it's bringing about the abatement at a higher cost than needed. Equalizing the tax would be okay, because it would get everybody to abate to the point where the marginal cost of abatement is $10 or whatever, and that would minimize the cost. Yes?
I see a big tension between sort of, like, this seems very efficient and doesn't seem necessarily like it has elements of equity.
Oh, I agree. No, and I just so exactly. Right.
Are there sort of blends of policies that are attempting to reconcile that?
Well, I mean, those are 2 separate policy objectives, and so they lead you in different directions. And then it comes down to the weight you place on the 2 objectives. So I'm not insensitive to equity. I'm going through some standard stuff. The other thing is, if you're going to regulate, a performance-based regulation is better. In other words, limiting a firm, let's say, to 50 tons of emissions is better than saying you should use this abatement technology or this production technology, because given that the concern is emissions, if you leave the firm total flexibility as to how it limits its emissions, you can't do better than that. Whereas sort of micromanaging and saying you've got to use this technology, it may be what the firm would choose, but if it's not what the firm would choose, sort of, as long as the firm limits its emissions to 50 tons, sort of, why do you care? Again, if there's some other things going on, then there would be a reason for care. But similarly, if you put the cap not on, say, an individual boiler, but on all the boilers in a plant, if there are multiple boilers, or not just on one plant, but all the plants owned by a given company, that should be fine, because as long as the emissions overall of this company are limited to a certain amount, why do you care whether 2/3 of the emission reduction comes from plant A and only 1/3 from plant B, or the other way around? Again, with perfect mixing and no other sort of effects, the more you focus narrowly on the objective that you care about, and the more flexibility you give the firm to bring about the objective, the more effective this is. Yeah.
I was wondering, because in Europe we have technology-based regulations to prevent extra emissions.
Well, it depends what you mean by technology-based regulation. It's one thing saying, I want you to limit your emissions to 50 tons, and I have to demonstrate that there exists a technology which makes that possible. Mm-hmm. That's different from saying you have to use that technology. So I'm making that distinction. If the technology merely plays the role of demonstrating the feasibility of a limit, but at the end of the day you're free to adopt some other technology as long as it limits the emissions.
Yeah, because there is this requirement you need to use the best available technique.
Best, yes. Well, but that's, okay, now that's a requirement that you use the technology, not that you limit the emissions to that. And the argument, and I'm going to come back to this, is that a technology standard isn't as good as an emissions. And let me emphasize, there are two very big issues at the end of the day. Tax versus standard versus emission trading. And I'm going to come back several times to this theme. And one reason why emission trading has worked well in the past for conventional pollutants is that it functioned more as a performance standard than the regulatory approaches it succeeded. And arguably, the performance standard would be better. In other words, I'm going to argue that what was so good in part was not the emission trading, but the performance standard nature of the cap, rather than technology standard or something else. So a few words. In the United States, when environmental regulation got going, so just to back up, the discussion of emissions taxes versus emissions limits, emission standards, got going and became very active among particularly American economists in the 1960s. When environmental regulation was introduced around 1970 in the United States, it just went in terms of direct regulation, also called command and control, not in the direction of taxes. In Europe, on the whole, environmental regulation got started significantly later. And the major wave of, in many cases, of European environmental regulation, as I understand, and the number of you here will correct me, was around 1990. By then, economists in general had sort of persuaded policymakers of the importance of taxes and financial incentives rather than just standards. And so the European wave of regulation starting in the 90s, in many cases, employed taxes. And in the US, the major revision of the Clean Air Act in 1990 employed emission trading. So it's like the second generation of taxes. And I have a few empirical slides which I'm going to rush through, which show the role of environmental taxes in a number of European countries. You can get copies of these slides, and I'm just going to zoom through them. Taxes on gasoline, carbon taxes in a few countries, sulfur taxes, nitrogen taxes for various pollutants, other things, water pollution charges, etc. So there's a variety of experimentation with taxes. In a number of cases, when green taxes were introduced, the revenue from the green taxes were used to lower other taxes. So it's what's called revenue recycling, business taxes, labor taxes, and so on. So the green taxes, the revenue was used to replace some other tax revenue. A word about the economic theory. This is a little bit of economic theory. So conventional taxes on output, sales taxes, capital taxes, labor, income taxes, and so on, are said by economists to be distortionary. because at the margin they create a wedge between, say, for an income tax, you produce widgets worth $10 an hour, but if there's a 10% income tax, you get only $9 an hour because one of the $10 you earn goes to taxes. So when you think about working, from a society's point of view, if you were to work an extra hour, you'd produce $10 worth of additional commodities. But from your perspective, you only get $9 because a dollar goes to taxes. So that will, in principle, distort how much you work because you're not getting the full benefits of and similarly with other taxes. And so a general observation is taxes create a distortion which undermines the market efficiency. I mean, they raise revenue for governments, but they come at a cost because of the distortion. Green taxes, Pigouvian taxes, are an exception because the tax is creating a distortion, but the distortion is exactly what you need there. It's the social cost that's being ignored by the actor who's just paying attention to the private cost. So that's one of the few cases where the distortion from a tax is a good thing, not a bad thing. It's actually what's desired because it represents the social cost that the actor is imposing on other people that he's ignoring, which doesn't have a parallel when you give up 10% of your wages to the government in income tax. So the thought that was raised, and it was actually a Berkeley PhD 25 years ago, that maybe if you have green taxes and you use the revenue to phase out existing taxes, that's a double win. On the one hand, you have the benefit of correcting the externality, and on the other hand, you reduce the distortion from other taxes. It's the so-called double dividend notion. You had a question? Okay, right, that's it. Well, so this was the subject of a huge literature starting about 10 years ago, and it turns out that the double dividend isn't so. Let me just see once. Yeah. So it's the second bullet point. So it turns out the double dividend doesn't necessarily work out, and the complication is. You may, for example, you put a tax on gasoline. I mean, this was a famous idea of Bill Clinton at the beginning. His first or second major policy fiasco was a BTU tax, which was then withdrawn when everybody screamed loudly enough. But there was an economic analysis, but the proposal was to have a BTU tax on gasoline and other forms of energy and use the money to lower the income tax, I think. But Larry Goulder at Stanford was sort of simulated this, pointed out it wasn't a double dividend because in general, the broader the base of the tax, the sort of better it is from an efficiency perspective. And gasoline tax, or BTU tax, even though it's quite broad, is still narrower than the income tax. And so that sort of undoes the double dividend effect.
Why?
Well, because you're replacing a non-distortionary tax, a BTU tax, if it's correctly calculated to measure the damage, the social damage from BTUs. The good thing is you're replacing a BTU tax, a non-distortionary tax. You're substituting a non-distortionary tax, a BTU tax, for a distortionary tax, but you're substituting a more narrowly based tax for a broader based tax, and that's not good. And you know.
Pardon me, what's BTU?
It's units of energy. So it was going to be a tax on fuels based on their energy equivalent, coal, oil, natural gas, and so on. So this just says, I actually think this argument against the double dividend is overblown for some technical reasons which are listed here, but I'm going to skip over them in the interest of moving along. I want to talk. I want to talk about emission trading, and all I want to say here was it was suggested in the late '60s, but implemented for the first time in the 1990 legislation, which went into effect in the U.S. in 1995. You see, it's sort of a mix of there's a cap on the emissions of individual actors, and there's a cap on therefore on the overall emissions. But individual actors can exchange emissions permits. So there's still a cap on the aggregate level of emissions. If there's 1 million permits issued, or permits for 1 million tons, then emissions are 1 million tons in 2008. But who does the emitting can move around if I exchange my permits for you. If I pay you to to clean up more, and I clean up less, so we still have the same, and in effect, that's what happens if I buy emission permits from you. So it still caps, but at the individual level, it provides the flexibility, and at the individual level, it functions more like carbon tax because of the price signal. Now, the price signal works two ways. One is I could not clean up all my units, but buy emission permits from you. In that case, my extra emissions over my limit have a cost, namely the price at which you sell me the emissions permits. And in that sense, it's like a tax. I'm not paying a tax to the government, I'm paying revenue to you for you to sell me 5 permits. Also, though, I could say to myself, you know, Michael, you've got a limit of 50 tons. But why don't you emit only 40 tons, and then you can sell 10 tons of emissions to somebody else? And if I fail to do that, I've passed up an opportunity cost of making the revenue of selling 10 tons. So even if the other price signal is there's the opportunity cost of you could have made some money by cleaning up more than you needed to and selling that. So it creates a price signal for individual emitters like a carbon tax, but it puts a fixed limit on the aggregate emissions like a regulation. That's the sense in which it's a blend.
In terms of limits for individual.
That's a good question. So it depends. The answer is there's basically 2 ways this happens. In one case, the government essentially gives away for free the emissions permits. So you get 10, you get 20, you get 30 or whatever. In the other case, the government sells them. So it says, I'll take bids for emission permits. You submit a bid to buy 10 at some amount, and you submit a bid to buy 20 or whatever, and I array the bids, and I then... Now, if I give them away, how do I give them away? And generically, there's sort of 2 ways. One is some sort of grandfathering. I give them away proportional to the emissions in some base period. For example, I want to reduce aggregate emissions by 20%, so everybody gets 20% less than their emissions in the year 2000 or something. And this way I reduce emissions 20% below 2000. The other possibility would be, I'm forgetting the name, could be I look at, if you like, best practices. And I figure out, okay, I look at your line of industry, I look at best practice production technology, benchmarking is the word. And I say, okay, the number of permits I give you may involve some reduction from a baseline, but the individual allocations are based on what you would need if you met some benchmark level of production. So if your emissions are higher than that, that's because, excuse me, but you're a slob, and that's your problem, not mine. You're still only getting so many emissions. So those are the distribution mechanisms. Benchmarking, sort of grandfathering, or some sort of auction or sale. So because of the trading, that is, there's a fixed cap on total emissions, but where the actual abatement takes place is a result of trading, you get the result of equalizing marginal cost, because people in principle will trade up to the point where their marginal cost of abatement equal the market price of emissions. The market price of emissions, there's a fixed supply of emissions, and then there's a demand curve for emissions, and so the market price reflects demand and supply forces.
So do you get, let's say that you give away permits.
Yes.
So do you get the distortion that you would get with the carbon tax that prevents the double dividend anyway? I mean, is it transferring money to the government that produces the problem, or is it simply the fact that you're requiring producers to reduce emissions and it costs money and raises prices?
It's just the land.
Okay.
There's no.
So you might as well auction them and use it to reduce the
yes.
tax, if you're going to do it at all.
Yes, although I'm going to say something in a moment about that. So I want to distinguish between the theory of emission trading and the empirical experience. And the point is, The theory is quite strong, although there are issues that I'm going to come back to. I haven't done with the theory. But the empirical experience has been kind of brilliant. It's been a brilliant success. The 1990 law called for it to start in 1995, and then for the major power plants, and then smaller ones come in 2000. But essentially within 5 years, emissions were reduced 50%. At a much lower cost, I mean a cost of about a third of what had been anticipated when this was being discussed. In the previous decade, that is throughout the 1980s, I think emissions, there was a stalemate on legislation, and emissions were reduced, I think, on the order of 10%. And so in 5 years, we got a sort of 50% reduction, and similarly with NOx in the Northeast.
So that reduction is specific to the identified players?
Yeah, but the total number of permits decline. I mean, the 50% reduction refers to 50% fewer total tons of SO2 emissions.
Okay. And my second question to you, how permits are actually distributed?
Okay, let me. Okay, so. Okay. So let me make a side remark. Emissions trading pollution has many features in common with water markets, which is something I also study. And in general, water markets and pollution markets are a good idea for the reasons for the same reasons, which are sort of they get a given aggregate level of emission reduction or water exchange at the minimum aggregate cost, so they minimize the cost. The problem with all these things is allocating the property rights, establishing the property rights in this. And that's an exercise in political economy. And in fact, in many cases, the players would rather not have a market than have a market based on allocations that are unfair. And I think this is one reason, not the only reason, but one reason behind the US, the Senate's objection to Kyoto. Because from some people's perspective, the allocations negotiated with Kyoto were unfair to the U.S. in two ways. One is the developing countries, and two countries, weren't limited, only the developed countries. And the other is some of the countries that were limited, namely Russia and the former Soviet Union, got fake allocations, because the allocations were based on emissions in 1990 or 1989, and the economies in those countries shrank greatly after the fall of communism. So they were getting emissions that, it's as though, so they were getting emissions, unlike everybody else, they were getting emissions limits, permits, way below their actual emissions. So they were getting freebies that they could sell without any harm, because they got way more emissions, in fact, than they needed. And that was considered by some people unfair. And my observation in water markets and other cases is, if you can't get an allocation of permits that people will accept, their opposition will kill the scheme, no matter how effective and wonderful the scheme would be if you could only move forward. But people move on. So the allocation is a big deal. Now, in the case of the 1990 legislation. Legislation on the Clean Air Act, updating the Clean Air Act, had been stymied for most of the decade of the 1980s. And the deadlock was broken by two things. One is the idea of emission trading, which came out in 1988, I think, was a new element and a more attractive element, because it gave polluters an asset they could sell. I mean, it gave them a limit, and from one point of view, it was, you could say, well, we wanted to impose a limit on them before, so how come they're now willing to accept a limit? Well, the answer is because if they did better than their limited, they could sell it and make some money. And so it gave them money. So that's one thing that changed the equation and made it politically acceptable. The other thing, though, is there was major horse trading in the Senate between when the legislation was introduced and when it passed, because the legislation specified the allocation to each individual boiler in the United States, and there was a certain amount of manipulation so that parties with powerful senators got a better allocation and others got a worse than was originally proposed. In other words, there was kind of an equilibrium in the political bargaining game. And the legislation only moved ahead when there was equilibrium in the political bargaining game. Now, yeah, did you have?
I have a question about that. So the states who got better...
It's power plants, not states.
Okay,
it's
plants.
Individual power boilers in individual power plants.
Power plants that got better deals.
Yes.
Did they end up emitting more?
That's a good question. I don't think, there have been a number of studies, but I haven't seen that assessed. It would be possible to calculate that, but I don't think the people who have studied it have done that. So it's interesting to compare this with California's legislation in 2006, which you're going to hear about later maybe, and which is buried in here, but I'm going to skip over. But in California, the California law committed the state to limiting emissions by 2020 to their level in 1990, and left it to the Air Board to figure out all the details, including, is it emission trading, are they given away for free, are they auctioned, if they're given away, what's the formula for giving them away. So that represents, so I want to contrast the style of sort of California and the US. In the US, it was only possible to move forward with legislation when there was a political deal. In California, there was strong support for this, and I characterize what California did as leaping off a cliff, under the theory that you'll put together a parachute before you hit the ground. In other words, there's a commitment to action, leaving all the details to be worked out later. So all the political bargaining, whereas in the US, it was the political bargaining had to have a successful outcome before the commitment moved forward. I'm going to compare cap and trade and tax, but I'm pointing out that you have multiple, in the context of greenhouse gases, multiple points of intervention. Now, not all greenhouse gases are associated with fossil fuels. Some are associated with land use, with soils, with chopping down trees. And I'll give you the statistic later on, but about 80% or 85% are associated with fossil fuels. So you could act where fossil fuel enters the economy, i.e. coal is imported into California or is mined in California. Oil is extracted in California or is imported into California or the United States or whatever the jurisdiction is. So you have upstream. You have midstream where fossil fuel is turned into energy, and then you have various levels of downstream. So Ford Motor Company makes cars. Well, maybe Ford is limited on the emissions of the cars itself. So that's in fact AB 1493, the structure of one of the California laws. But it could be people who buy cars. There's actually a big debate in England about individual household permits, where each household would get some permits, presumably based on the number of people in the household. And so depending upon how many cars your household has and how much you drive, you'd be using a permit. So you have sort of upstream, midstream, and then various levels of downstream. I just want to point that out. And likewise with the tax. You could have a tax on the carbon content of any fossil fuel. You could have a tax on electricity. You could have various downstream taxes. So my point is there are important sort of design issues with about where you intervene in either case for a tax. And likewise, as I've said, you could have a cap upstream, midstream, or downstream. With air pollution, so it's a different situation. The cap was on the individual electric power plants, on the individual boilers. I'll come back to this. And as I say, the California's law was a cap applied to each automobile company that sold cars in California. And it was a cap on the emissions of the fleet of new cars sold by that company each year in California. So you'd look at all the new cars sold by Ford or General Motors or Toyota in California in 2012. You'd figure out the emissions per vehicle. This is just for the new vehicles. And there was a cap on the aggregate emissions of new Toyotas or new Fords or whatever sold in California. So that would be an example of a downstream cap. An upstream cap is essentially similar to a carbon tax because an upstream cap limits the greenhouse gases associated with oil, coal, natural gas coming into the California economy. And essentially, it's like a tax on the carbon content of oil tanks and oil, natural gas, and coal coming into the economy to be distributed. But the downstream ones play out differently. And as I say, there's sort of the income distribution implications are different in terms of paying money to the government under a tax, and particularly with free allocation, you get something that you can sell. Some observations on cap and trade. They're similar. With a cap, you know what the aggregate level of emissions is because there's a cap. You don't know where they're coming from, but you know that there's a cap each year on emissions. With a tax, you presume that because of the tax there'll be fewer emissions than otherwise, but you don't know how much fewer because it depends on the response to the tax. I'm going to come back to it. With a tax, you know what the price of carbon is because it's whatever the tax is. With emissions trading, you don't know ahead of time what the price of carbon is because it depends on the price in the market, and there can be volatility. Depending upon supply and demand circumstances, there's a market every day, the price can fluctuate.
Obviously, if you want to adjust the tax, it'd be fairly simple. But adjusting the permit program, do you just...
So, good. So, actually, adjusting the tax in practice isn't simple because raising the tax, whatever it is, means pushback. Where cap and trades have been introduced, caps and trade have been introduced, there's actually been a schedule laid out, for example, in the 1990 Clean Air Act, and in the EU emission trading. This is the number of tons permitted in year one, in year two, or for the first 5 years it's this, and for the next 5 it's that. So actually the cap has been legislated, the change in the cap, at least for a certain block of time, when emission trade has been introduced. And empirically, it may be easier to lower the cap than to raise the tax, but that's a contingent empirical fact. But that's sort of... this was emission trading in Los Angeles, in the South Coast Air Basin, for, SO2. And when the electricity crisis hit in California in 2000, and electric utilities were desperate to use really old, dirty power plants rather than buy electricity. They wanted, in order to use these old, dirty power plants that nevertheless were vastly cheaper than buying on the wholesale market, they were willing to pay whatever it took for emission permits, and so you see an example of a price spike. And so one of the issues that's discussed is whether there are ways of preventing price spikes, of damping price spikes in emissions trading schemes. And there's several proposals on the table which are listed here. One is a trigger. This is being discussed in the context of national legislation in Washington. There's a price, and if the market price goes above that, the cap is relaxed, so for that year or that month or for some period of time. Another notion is you have a board of, an independent board, sort of like the Federal Reserve, which decides whether, if the market is wild, to relax the cap. It could also put additional permits on the market to push the price down. So it could manage the price by relaxing the cap or adding extra supply to the market. Another issue is sort of hedging and banking borrowing. Hedging is financial markets with secondary markets. Banking and borrowing, banking is if I, so typically the permits are for a year. I mean, they're for some period of time. It could be for multiple years. It could be for a 2-year period or a 3-year period. Up to now, it's been for a year. And this actually happened with SO2 in the US. If I reduce emissions more than I need to in 2008, can I carry that over because in 2009 or 2010, maybe I will need it? That's banking. Borrowing would be the other way around. If I need I mean, it's going to be really expensive. Something happened and I have really high emissions in 2008. Can I borrow against 2009 or 2010's permits and use those? And there's the question of bankruptcy. So borrowing is more problematic than banking, but those are ways of alleviating the effects of a price spike. Okay, so I'm going to go on. In terms of the political economy, taxes in the United States are a four-letter word. And so imposing new taxes are problematic, whereas cap and trade, this is what I've said, sort of handles the political economy better if they're given away for free. Although, in fact, there's now a trend to talk about auctioning some or maybe all of the permits. But anyhow. And there's some practical issues that arise. You've got to, if you have whether you have a carbon tax or a cap and trade, you've got to measure these things in order to collect the tax or to collect the cap. And so, so that affects where the tax is or where the cap is imposed, how many actors you have to measure. And leakage is this notion. Suppose, and this has been discussed for California, California limits its greenhouse gas emissions, and we decide not to buy coal from Utah because it generates greenhouse gas emissions, and actually that counts against our California cap. The emissions associated with electricity generated out of state but imported in California count against our total in our own law. So we say we're not buying this power from this plant in Utah that uses coal. So it doesn't sell electricity to us. Instead, it sells to some user in Arizona who used to get wind power, who doesn't get wind power, and we buy the wind power that they got, and the end result is the same amount of greenhouse gas emissions generated, not consumed by California, but consumed by somebody else, and so from a larger point of view, nothing is gained. That's leakage. The emissions move someplace else as a result of the scheme. Two answers to that. One answer is, well, we only have jurisdiction, any sovereign entity only has jurisdiction over itself, and the fact that we can't legislate what happens in Arizona or Utah is not a reason not to do anything. It means we won't, if we were dictator of the world, we could accomplish more, but that's the breaks. But the other thing in California is the governor energetically has pursued what I call greenhouse gas diplomacy of trying to build alliances with other states and get them to commit to the same reduction target as California. Now, all of this is perfectly generic. And I want to spend the last about half of the time, whatever it is, talking about special issues of greenhouse gases. So I started off by stressing that greenhouse gases conceptually were a pollutant just like SO2 or BOD in water or anything else. But they're different in ways that change the calculus. Now, they're different in one way that doesn't change the calculus, but needs to be noted. They're a stock pollutant, not a flow pollutant. In other words, it's not the emissions this year that cause damage, the way emissions of BOD or SO2 cause air pollution this year. These things cause damage by accumulating over decades or longer in the atmosphere, and that causes the damage. So it's the cumulative total over years, over decades, that causes the damage. The other thing is the scale of this is truly global. No other pollutant is global. And so that complicates things because action by any individual sovereignty isn't going to fix the problem the same way as it would with a local pollutant. But the other thing is uncertainty is overwhelming greenhouse gases. And it's not that there's no uncertainty with them figuring out the effects of SO2 emissions but uncertainty because of the scale over which this is playing out, this is going to play out. Today's emissions are going to have consequences literally over centuries. And while we have some idea scientifically, the only way we'll know for sure is waiting for centuries in terms of thermal expansion of the ocean. I mean, there's some things that are shorter lived, but still the scale of this is totally different, and the scale of the uncertainty is totally different. California set a 2020 goal and a 2050 goal. And again, this makes it different than conventional greenhouse gases, or water pollutants. The 2020 goal is comparable to the sort of goals we had under the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and other legislation. The 2050 goal is, mind-boggling. It's a major change in technology, in the structure of the economy, a decarbonization of the economy. We haven't undertaken anything like that anywhere with existing air or water pollution laws. And we can't do it in a short period of time. In fact, we have no idea how to do it or whether it's possible to get that big a reduction within that short a time. All we can try and do is sort of point in the direction and set things in motion, but it's a much more open-ended policy goal than anything we're faced with conventional air pollutants. And so the complication compared to conventional air pollutants is we have to get emission reduction now, but at the same time not undercut more profound, more fundamental changes that need to take place later. We don't want, for example, to get a lock-in to a technology which gives a small reduction, which meets the short-term target, but is going to screw up the long-term target. So again, the spatial scale is very different. We've got to act now, but we've also got to take actions which leave the way open for future actions. So I just want to stress it's much more complicated. Now, if you step back and come back to the question of how much should we reduce emissions? An economist would say, well, you've got to look at the costs of reducing emissions and what's gained by reducing emissions, the damages from pollution. And you want to balance them. And the formal approach would be you balance them. You go for a level of emission reduction to the point where the marginal benefit of emission reduction just is offset by the marginal cost of emission reduction. No more, no less.
Can I ask about your, on the previous slide regarding
Yes.
long-term 2050, you focused on innovation and
Yes.
technology. What about cultural lifestyle?
Oh, yes, also, absolutely. Yeah. So I'm contrasting here two different mindsets which underlie the U.S. policy position, not the White House. And let me stress, in my own experience, President Bush is on a separate planet in terms of attitudes to climate change. But if you look at Congress in general, if you look at conventional wisdom inside the Beltway and conventional thinking among most economists, then it's very different than what you find in the EU, both in government and in economic, among economists. So there's a very different mindset. And it corresponds to really these two framings or conceptions of the problem. One, that we have to balance, and obviously a certain amount of reduction is called for, but it's an amount that has to be justified by the damage compared to the cost of abatement. And the other view, that there's a dangerous threshold, and we just have to keep concentrations below that threshold. And the threshold is kind of scientifically determined, and 550 parts per million or 450 or whatever. And the policy goal is just to keep concentrations below that level. So I'm stressing these are two different framings of the problem. And as I said, the EU, not just in government, but in academic circles, academic economics, leans to an imperative approach. And the mainstream one is more the balancing. We should do something, but not too much. We should do whatever is justified by what we estimate the marginal damage from pollution, from emissions, from greenhouse gases to be. Now, this difference in vision is also reflected in the assessment of the marginal damage from pollution. So in the US, discussions of the marginal damage a few years ago, 3 years ago, was a figure like $8 per ton of CO2. And Bill Nordhaus at Yale, who's the kind of dean of climate economists, now says, I think $14 or $15 a ton of CO2. And there's been some discussion among Democrats in Congress about maybe a trigger price, a cap of $20. In the EU, in the emissions trading market today, the price of carbon permit is something like $35 a ton of CO2. And in policy circles, they think of a price up to $50 as being acceptable. If there was a cap, it would be at $50 or something higher. So the US view is the damage from carbon calculated today, it'll be different later, but calculated today is, let's say, $14 a ton of CO2. And we should be willing to spend that much, but not more, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And in Europe, the price of carbon is seen as $35 to $50. And this reflects, as I'm going to indicate, a number of differences in the perception of damages. And this is reflected in the response to the Stern Review, which came out almost 2 years ago in October 2006 by then Sir Nicholas Stern, chief economist at the time of the British government, who argued that urgent action with sharp emission reductions globally was called for, compared to Nordhaus, who's written quite harsh critiques of Stern, and whose view I've described is that the price of carbon is about $14 and modest reductions, 5 or 10% right now, greater reductions later in the century are called for. So the question is, why this difference among economists in assessing the same phenomenon? Now, one issue which entered the debate is discounting. And the fact is that Nordhaus and Stern use very different discount rates. And Stern uses a discount rate which is much lower than economists have conventionally used, like Nordhaus, in the literature. So let me explain what I mean by the discount rate and why this is relevant. Climate change is very much an intergenerational transfer, in the sense that we spend money now to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and we produce effects 50, 60, 100, 200 years from now. I mean, the empirical evidence is that if the developed countries reduce their emissions sharply today, there will be no difference in consequences in temperature, precipitation, for at least 40 years. But, partly because the emissions of the past decades are still working their way through the system and will have an effect. So if we reduce emissions sharply today, it will have an effect, but not for 40 or 50 years at the least. It has an effect, and the effect grows larger over time. But we would be spending money now to avoid unpleasant consequences in the future. 50 years, 100 years, 200 years in the future. And so the question, does it make, if you think of this in monetary terms, Ramon, does it make sense to give up $1 now to save $1 100 years from now? That's what discounting is about. And the discount rate, the annual discount rate, so if you use 4%, you should only give up 18 cents today to save $1 100 years from now. If you use 1.4 cents, you should. I'm sorry, I said 18%. You should only give up 1.8 cents, so under 2 cents, to save $1 in the future. If you use 1.4%, it's 12 times that. You should give up a quarter today to gain $1. 200 years out, it makes a big difference which discount rate you calculate, because given the same agreement on the damages 100 years from now, whether you should spend 1.8 cents or 25 cents today, as it were. Right? Let me just talk about discounting. So two slides with those. One is, it is an ethical choice, because there are effects on the future generation, and the question whether we should value $1 to the future generation as worth only 25 cents today or 1.8 cents is inevitably, among other things, an equity judgment. There are also two technical points, which I don't have time to go into, which actually haven't been discussed much in the academic debate about discounting, but which are very relevant. And let me just focus on, well, I'll say a word about both of them, because they're common. John Crotilla, a famous economist who passed away a few years ago, sort of was one of the founders of environmental economics, and he wrote a famous paper in 1967 called Conservation Reconsidered. 1967 was still in the aftermath of the Cold War era. And there was a huge concern from the Cold War era about strategic minerals. We needed whatever molybdenum and rare minerals to make jet fighters and ordnance and whatever. And there was a big scare about the U.S., the free world and the U.S. would run out of molybdenum and whatever it was needed. And this was, in the 50s, this was a whole big deal, scarce, whatever it was, strategic minerals. And Crotilla wrote this paper in 1967, which said the following. It's the American Economic Review, 1967, Conservation Reconsidered. And what he said is, the ultimate scarcity is the natural environment. It's not molybdenum and aluminum and these other things. And sooner or later, we will find a substitute, and technologists will find a substitute for molybdenum and these other things. They will find, fibers or composites or whatever, and they'll be able to make weapons of mass destruction, with substitutes, even if all the molybdenum in the world runs out. There will be substitutes. That's the good news. There are no substitutes for the natural environment. You can go to Disneyland and see, but that's not a substitute for being in an unspoiled wilderness. And the unspoiled natural environment shrinks over time as it gets paved over, as people, as cities expand, as people develop. And there is never a substitute for that. That's the real scarcity. That's the ultimate scarcity. And he argued over time, those things will become much more valuable than molybdenum or composites or whatever, because there are no substitutes for them. And their supply is ever shrinking. Well, that's kind of the same notion here, because this is not, at the end of the day, giving up $1 now to put $1 in the hands of somebody 100 years from now. This is giving up $1 now to protect an environment, ecosystem, a climate for somebody 100 years ago. And if the climate gets changed and degraded, it will be worth more relative to the things money can buy 100 years from now than it is today. This is sort of Crotilla's argument. And that's not factored. And that has the effect of pushing the discount rate down. I'm going to skip the second point in the interest of moving on. So what I want to say is there's actually a richer debate about discounting. And it's A, it's an ethical issue, and B, these two issues haven't been factored in. And based on them, I think you can build a case to justify the low interest rate of Stern. Yes? Sorry.
I was just curious. I didn't understand why, the point you brought up, the fact that there's no substitute for the environment, that I can understand why that would increase the cost.
It's not the cost, it's the value. You have... It's like a Rembrandt. If half the Rembrandts get destroyed between now and 2100, I mean, you can say if you want to buy them, the cost is higher, but it also means, if you appreciate them, there's now only 50 Rembrandts instead of 100 Rembrandts.
The value's higher, so in other words, the cost of me of losing it is higher. Right?
That's right,
okay.
right.
So I understand, but wouldn't that increase the numerator?
No, it increases the value of Rembrandts relative to money, because money can buy Twinkie bars and, Toyota. Because we're trading off commodities now, more expensive Toyotas, more expensive Twinkie bars, for protecting wilderness areas, unspoiled environments, unspoiled landscapes in the future. And the rate at which we exchange money for something that money can't buy, that rate changes. The rate, what we would be willing to give up to protect the environment 100 years from now, where it's much scarcer, will be greater than what we're willing to give up today when it's less scarce. I mean, that is that's what I said is exactly the assertion.
How would that rating be influenced if you go with the theory that the natural environment can be restored? Because some people may say that natural environment can be restored. So
that would change it. If that were true, that would mean that you just spend money at 2100 and you bring it back. However, it's not obvious that it can be. On this, but even in Crotilla's context, it's not clear that. if you have a remote valley that is now built over and has, you know, a town with 10,000 people living there, you could say, well, we can just remove the people and knock it all down, but yes?
Would another approach to favoring a lower interest rate in these calculations be to say that a positive interest rate presumes economic growth insofar as...
Well, if there was no economic growth, yeah, well, this relates to the second point. Okay, since... I'll say something about the second point. The second point actually is skipped over by most people, but I think is important. It's based on the notion of diminishing marginal utility. So if you're richer, an extra dollar has a lower value to you than if you're poorer. If you have $50,000 income versus $200,000, getting an extra dollar. Well, the argument is that the argument being made here is that the future will be, people in the future will be much richer than they are today. Now, accept that for a moment. I mean, incomes in the US are twice what they were in real terms about 30 years ago. So, you know, if a person of a given age in today is twice as rich in money income, in real terms, as somebody of the same age or whatever with in 1970. So here's the question. The argument is if you're richer, the value of money goes down. What I think is wrong and what I'm getting here is I think people's expectations change. I mean, so my example is when I grew up, I was 15 or 16 before there was the first television set in Manchester when I grew up. It was a small black and white television set. But now expectations have changed. If you don't have a color TV set in every room, including a flat panel in 3 of the rooms, you're considered a nobody. And so you expect more. And that dampens the increase in wealth. It doesn't mean that you're not richer, but it means you're not as rich as you would be if the expectations were still the same. And therefore the marginal utility doesn't plummet as much as it would if the expectations stayed the same and we were just richer. And if you factor, and I think changing expectations are a fact of life. It's not something I invented. The issue is not whether I approve of it or disapprove of it. The fact is it happens and will happen. And that's omitted in the calculations. And that would greatly damp down the decline in marginal utility. But I want to move on, because this is the number of points I want to make. So discounting is important, but it's not everything. Actually, there's major disagreements about the amount of the damages and about the cost of emission reduction and about the role of uncertainty. And I want to say a few things. So I have been doing work and writing a paper arguing not that Stern is right, but that Nordhaus is wrong. Because I'm focusing specifically, Nordhaus is very transparent and gives data on disaggregation of his analysis, and he gives a table showing his calculation of the damages to various regions of the world if there were a 2.5 degree warming by the end of the century. And one of the regions is the United States. And I don't know about the whole world, but I do know very extensively all the literature done on the United States. And so I think he is wrong in his assessment of the damages to the United States by a factor of 3 or 4. And there are 2 things going on that I want to explain. Oh boy, this is bizarre. There's a slide which somehow vanishes. Let me say this. I have no idea why there's a slide that won't show up. But before let me go back and say this. So let me give you some numbers, and I'm just going to say them from memory. I'm going to take a particular emissions scenario, but it's just an illustration. And it's the low emissions scenario, what's called the B1 scenario, as modeled by Hadley 2 in 2001 for the 3rd IPCC. No, excuse me, for the 4th, it's Hadley 3 for the 3rd, for the recent IPCC. And that projects a change in global temperature under that emission scenario of 2.1 degrees Celsius by 2100. And that's the change in the global annual average temperature. But that's the global temperature. And around in the ocean, it heats up less, and on land, it heats up more, and towards the equator, it heats up less, and towards the poles, it heats up more. And the figure for the United States is something like, for California, something like 3.5 degrees. So the global is 2.1, but the United States is 3.5. But that's or for California, but that's the annual average. In the winter, it heats up less. In the summer, it heats up more. So in the winter, it's like 2.3. In the summer, it's 3.8. But that's all of California. Along the coast, it heats up less. In the Central Valley and in Southern California, it heats up more. And it's closer to 5 degrees Celsius. And so here we have 2.1 global average annual temperature and almost 5 degrees summer temperature in Los Angeles and in the farming areas of California where crops are grown. Now the consequences of 5 are very different than the consequences of 2.1. And so one thing is a lot of the existing, the older economic analysis framed the analysis in terms of the global average temperature and not the average temperature at particular places where economic activity occurs at times of year, because the winter temperature isn't that important for crops, for most crops, but the summer temperature is. And therefore the average, the annual temperature matters less than the temperature during the growing season. So what I'm stressing is the difference, the effect of spatial and temporal averaging. And in the last 5 years, there's been much more disaggregation, what's called downscaling, spatially in time. And in some places, the changes are much lower than average, and in others, they're much higher. But the second point, and this is where this comes in, is the effects are asymmetrical. So let me explain this diagram. But this shows the effect of temperature on the horizontal axis in degrees Celsius up to 40 degrees Celsius, and crop yield measured on a log scale with the 0 reference point. And this is actually based on an analysis of 50,000 fields or something like that growing corn or wheat. It's essentially the same thing for corn and wheat and other grains in the United States over 50 years of data. So, but let me just draw something in the air. For crops, if it's cold and gets warm, this is good, because it can be too cold for crops. And so the yield rises when it gets warm. But if it gets too warm, then this is bad, and you kill the plant, and the yield falls. So temperature, increase in temperature is good at first and then bad. The same is true, for example, with energy. If it gets warm, you need less energy for winter heating, if it gets warm in winter. But if it gets warm in summer and gets too warm, then you need more energy for air conditioning. So you save energy in the winter, but then if it gets too hot, then you need a lot of energy for air conditioning. Similarly with direct mortality. Human beings die from cold in the winter and from extreme heat in the summer. If it gets warmer in the winter, you have fewer deaths from cold. If it gets too warm in the summer, if it gets warmer in the winter, you have fewer deaths from cold. If it gets warmer in the winter, you have more deaths from heat. And again, you have relationships which are like that. Now, it's been, many of the economists who studied this have modeled this by a quadratic function which is symmetric. And the symmetry means in the cold areas you gain going up, although in the hot areas you gain the temperature, you go down the curve. But the symmetry means there's some chance, depending upon the distribution of temperatures and changes, that the gains offset the losses. You have to put them together. In fact, there's reason to believe the relationship is not symmetrical. And this is the finest study in the agronomic literature anywhere of the effect on yields of grains. And you see there is a gain. There's a slow gain going up. And then when you hit something like, I think it's 29 or 30 degrees Celsius, there's a sharp decline. But this is not symmetric. The losses from excessive temperatures are way greater than the gains in cool areas from a warming of temperatures. And so the gains don't balance out the losses. But up till now, in a lot of the literature, this has been reflected in a symmetric curve, which literally would look like if you flip the right-hand side, so it went down. This combination of disaggregation, spatially and temporally, and the extremely nonlinear and asymmetric damage put together change the calculation of damages for the US or other broad areas compared to what's considered. And so the first column here is Nordhaus's, in his 2000 book, his calculation of the damages, market and non-market, from 2.5 degree warming for the United States in $1990. And that comes out at about less than 0.5% of GNP. My own analysis, going through keeping some of his numbers, but so he assumes there's no effect on water. He assumes there's no effect on energy. He assumes there's no effect on human mortality. That in all of these cases, the sort of warming in cool areas balances the excess warming in hot areas. And and I don't have time to go through the literature, but I come up with a number which is essentially 4 times his for the United States.
Because you weren't adjusting, because you... You adjusted differently for water and for...
I looked at studies we and other people have done on the effects on water and find that there are likely damages, and so I'm extrapolating. So, and then uncertainty, and this relates to what you've read by Marty Weitzman, and this is just one slide saying this, is the issue of risk aversion arises. Now, because, and as I point out here, these are risks that, for the most part, can't be hedged in financial markets. These, because the outcomes are not financial. It's not that someone will give you some money if you know, we have a drought or you know, there's extreme heat events and you can't go outdoors because it's 115 degrees for 3/4 of the time in the summer. The point is, these effects are local. That is, the threats of drought, extreme heat events, and whatever. These occur in particular watersheds, you know, in urban areas, not in rural areas and whatever. So they're not global risks in the sense that everybody faces this same outcome. But for the people who face them, these are things that they would like to avoid, and they would have, I think, a willingness to pay a premium, as it were, an insurance premium, to avoid them. And when you add this up over all the people who are affected in various ways, you know, around the globe, you get a significant insurance premium based on risk aversion, which is ignored, which is not included in my numbers, but will push the numbers up even further, and reframes the issue as one of risk management. We will be taking action to reduce emissions now to avoid the risk of unpleasant events. And we're not exactly certain if they, you know, how big the damage will be. But frankly, it's better not to run that risk and find out. I mean, that would be the argument, and that's literally what a risk premium is. Going back to what I just said a moment ago, the question of how large are the damages and how is partly one of the discount rate, partly one of the raw assessment of damages, partly one of whether you add a risk premium, and also I think Nordhaus overstates how large the cost of reducing emissions would be. And so there's a whole set of issues which underlie, I think, this difference in worldview of, is the damage $14 a ton or is it $50 a ton? And should we just try and get below a threshold, or should we just sort of balance in whatever happens? Now, I want to race through a lot of stuff. This is all about California. I want to preempt, or at least jump into a session later on about policy, and give you, there are 2 things I'd like to do, and let me see if I can do them both in the remaining time. So first I want to come back and beat up on emission trading. And I want to, I want to go back and remind you of the theory of how emission trading works. And the theory is that it generates price signals. I mean, because a price is put on carbon, because there's a market to buy emission permits, that in turn is a cost which should be internalized in commodities that are intensive in carbon and in commodities that are intensive in them. And so that creates a price signal which radiates throughout the economy, as it were, downstream and upstream encourages substitutes and gets shifts in behavior. So that's the theory of how emission trading works. And this just repeats what I said before. The empirical evidence is that emission trading worked fine. So it's like the theory says it's going to work fine, the empirical evidence says it works fine, so what exactly is the problem? Before I understand what we excuse me, have the remnants of a cold. We also used emission trading successfully, not as dramatic, but still to get big reductions in lead gasoline in the 1980s and in CFCs. So here's the thing. Emission trading didn't work in practice the way the theory says. The way it worked in practice was the party that was capped took actions to reformulate the product or to change the production process, and that fixed the problem. And basically, the only person who acted was the party that was capped. So to take the example, unleaded gasoline became more expensive than leaded gasoline. But the reason we don't have leaded gasoline is not because the price of unleaded was so much higher that people stopped driving cars or drove less. And the reason is we frankly bought gasoline and have driven cars exactly the same way as we did before, and it was the refiners who just, at a modest cost, got rid of the lead. And so it wasn't the price signal radiating throughout the economy, it was the party that was capped, did something to fix the problem. Similarly with SO2, the people who were generating electricity with fossil fuels fixed the problem. How did they fix the problem? Well, they switched which power plants they used. They still used all power plants, but they used coal ones less often, and nuclear and oil and natural gas more often, because those have lower SO2 emissions. They switched from high sulfur coal to low sulfur coal, which has low sulfur emissions, and they stuck a scrubber at the end of pipe, which was a 30-year technology. Scrubbers had been around since the 60s. They were expensive, which is why many plants didn't use them if they didn't need to. But you could install a scrubber at the end of an existing plant and keep using the existing plant. So what happened was the entities that were capped changed the problem by modifying how they operated their existing assets. And essentially, the rest of the economy went through life unaffected. Does this mean emission trading didn't do anything? No, because as I indicated at the beginning, it was like a performance standard. It gave much more flexibility than the regulatory mechanisms that it replaced, and the flexibility lowered the cost. You could have had the same flexibility with a different regulatory mechanism without the cap and trade. So I think the flexibility was very important. Let's talk about what didn't happen with SO2. Energy conservation played no role. Renewables played no role. New technologies for combustion, for treatment played no role. What happened was reoperating existing facilities using off-the-shelf technologies that had existed for some time. So the question is, what is the prognosis for greenhouse gases? And the answer, in my view, is that the prognosis is terrible because the analogs don't exist for greenhouse gases. We don't have low CO2 coal the way there's low SO2 sulfur. We don't have end-of-pipe treatment. Carbon capture and sequestration doesn't exist today. It may exist one day, but it can't be applied to any existing power plant that exists today. There's not much you can do to modify the operation of existing fossil fuel plants. In fact, the only way really to get a major reduction in existing fossil power fuel plants is not to operate them, make them museums or art galleries, as has been done in London. Not for greenhouse gas purposes. You can do things with new fossil fuel power plants that you build. There's very little you can do with existing fossil fuel plants. Now, if you think that emission trading worked by generating price signals that radiated throughout the economy, well, it sure will radiate price signals, but that's not how it worked. In the past, it worked because the people who were capped for SO2 or NOx had on-the-shelf alternatives that they could turn to. They don't for greenhouse gases. That's the point. So So two things. With greenhouse gases, we could regulate electricity generation. That was two-thirds of the, I'm sorry, for SO2, that was two-thirds of the SO2 emissions. For greenhouse gases in the US, that's only one-third of the greenhouse gases. And in California, it's only one-fifth of the greenhouse gases, which leaves four-fifths of the problem not solved. You have to go to the whole swath of the economy, to everybody who drives a car, everybody who uses electricity. You know, this is, and the point is, you can't take the existing power plants and wave a wand and make them low CO2 the way you could essentially make them low SO2. The larger problem is exactly this, that we are stuck with the wrong set of assets. We have fossil fuel power plants that can't readily be reoperated. We have SUVs and gas guzzlers that can't readily be reoperated. You can just not drive them as much, but you can't wave a wand and make them not use gasoline. We have urban sprawl and suburbs and no public transportation. We have the wrong city layout. You can't wave a wand and make that much more public transportation. This is about, with SO2, with other things, essentially you could reoperate existing assets at some cost, but you could reoperate existing assets and reduce emissions. That's absolutely... Yeah.
I just had a question. So, do you think, for the 2020 goal, do you think that the program
yes,
is
so
sufficient, or are you talking
yes.
about 2050 goal?
Well, so, okay, so good. So one of the slides I passed over said, our analysis was that California could meet the 2020 goal. But that's because in California, it's intended to be met not just by emission trading, but by major regulatory thrusts, pushing energy efficiency, raising appliance efficiency, building standards, combined heat and power, and other things. And this is actually different again in the political economy. I was in Australia and New Zealand for the last 2 weeks talking with government ministers and their advisors. And the price signal model is we will make energy more expensive and people will use less energy, and that's how we'll get emissions down. The California model is we will, through regulations, make energy users more energy efficient. And so there will be some increase in the price of electricity as a result of this. But the main effect will be that people will be able to get by using less electricity because of energy efficiency regulation. And now I am going to, I want to go, so I have to, the one thing I passed over, this is the iconic. This is electricity use per capita in the United States and California, essentially in the last 50 years. From 1960 to the early 70s, it was rising at the same rate. The slope is essentially the same in both places. In the US, it's continued to rise so that it's now about 50% higher than it was in the mid-70s. In California, which is when regulatory action started, it stopped rising, and it is no higher today than it was then. And this reflects a regulatory approach and a regulatory-induced change in behavior that occurred in California but not in the US. So to answer your question, the view is that California can meet its greenhouse gas, its 2020 targets by more of this, but applied to greenhouse gases, not just electricity. The US could do the same, but there's a question, there's a lot of turning around, so the story about assets is about that. If you don't mind, I want to charge on to a couple more messages, literally in the last 5 minutes. So I've argued that greenhouse gas emissions, so I have argued that this is a much more challenging problem, and I think really requires not just way more than price changes. So this is changing behaviors, institutions throughout a broad section of the economy, and ultimately promoting new incentives. So I want to argue that price signals are only part. I don't believe in the omnipotence of price signals. As a businessman once said to me, incentives work, but the carrot has to be in front of the donkey, not behind, otherwise the donkey will pay no attention. And I want to argue that the sectoral policies that California has applied in the past and intends to apply here work. didn't have the words here, because they get these sectors to pay attention to alternatives that they wouldn't otherwise consider, things that are unfamiliar, things that are outside the consideration set, to use a term that marketers do. And so what those things do is they make actors more responsive to the price signal by forcing them to change, to do things that otherwise wouldn't happen in the market. And so you need a price signal, but the price signal alone without these other things won't work, because this makes the whole economy, actors in the economy, more responsive to the price signal, more able to reduce emissions. There are, and I also want to argue that the conventional economic analysis sort of omits factors that will kick in, and it's like you have to set this in motion, and you need regulatory approaches like a renewable portfolio standard to get things moving. But eventually, I think you won't need those things, but only after you've sort of got the economy moving in a different direction that can be more responsive. I want to spend the last few minutes on this, which is just a few slides, but it's very important. Because come back to, we said that a cap is a limit on emissions, and a tax, is a price signal. And which do you want? And remember, this comes back to this view that do we need to limit emissions, or do we just need to put a price out there and then let firms reduce emissions up to the point where the price makes it cost effective? This hinges on a piece of work by Weitzman, not the piece you looked at, that's also lurking here, and I want to just explain it for the last 5 minutes. In the world of total emissions, I could set a price on carbon, and I would know how much you would reduce your carbon emissions. Or I could issue a cap. So this is not the Weitzman paper. This is a different Weitzman's paper. Right? Or I could issue a cap, and in principle, I could get the same result, because I'd know what the emission reduction would be with the tax, and so I could either regulate that emission reduction or give you a tax. That's if there was perfect certainty. With uncertainty, where I don't know exactly what your abatement costs are and what your circumstances are, there's a big difference between a tax and a cap. With a cap, as I said, you know what the emission reduction will be. With a tax, you know there will be some emission reduction, but you don't know how much. Depends how expensive it is to reduce emissions. If it's real cheap, you'll get a lot more emission reduction than you expected, and if it's real expensive, you'll get less. So in terms of certainty, a cap tells you what will happen, a tax doesn't. It turns out in terms of economic efficiency, a tax works better if you're frightened of making a mistake about how expensive emission abatement is than a cap. If emission abatement turns out to be more expensive than you thought, the cap will be way off. If emission abatement turns out to be much more expensive than you thought, firms won't abate that much, given the tax that you set, and at least you'll sort of back off what you thought would happen. So it turns out you're going to make an error whether you set a cap or whether you have an emissions tax. And the question becomes, so which error is the worse? I'm going to screw up, which error is less serious? And Weitzman showed that it depends on something arcane. It depends on whether the marginal damage from more emissions is steeper or flatter than the marginal cost of abatement. So let me just explain this one. Consider two scenarios. The marginal damage from abatement is flat, or the marginal damage from abatement the marginal damage from emissions is flat, or the marginal damage from emissions is steep. If it's flat, it means, gee, whether you have emissions of 100 or 200, the marginal damage is about the same. Nothing changes very much. If it's steep, it's like a threshold. If you have emissions of 100, the marginal damage is X. If you have emissions of 200, the marginal damage is 3X. So something changes, so makes a big difference whether emissions are 100 or 200. Whereas if the marginal damages are flat, there's more damages if you have 200 than 100, but they're not that different because the marginal damage is about the same. Similarly with the marginal cost of abatement. If the marginal cost of abatement is flat, whether you do more abatement or less abatement, Obviously, if we do more abatement, it costs more, but the extra cost isn't that different because the marginal cost of abatement is the same. If the marginal cost of abatement is rising, then if you do 200 units of abatement, the marginal cost is much higher than if you do only 100 units of abatement. The cost goes up greatly. So it turns out if the marginal damage curve is steeper, you want to make sure the emissions stay below a limit. And the cap is what you do, because that gives you certainty. If the marginal abatement cost is steeper, then it turns out, go with a price signal. Because if you make a mistake in guessing the abatement cost and you go with a cap, you can go way wrong and set the cap way wrong. So it turns out that this carries over from a flow pollutant to a stock pollutant. So the question is, what do these damn curves look like? What do the damn curves look like? If the marginal damage curve is flat, you should go with a price signal, which is the sort of consensus in Washington. If it's steep, you've got to lower emissions, which is the EU view. Well, this is what it has been calculated, and there's a confidence interval. But you see that the marginal damage is flat as can be, and the marginal cost of abatement is steep. And you look at that and you say it is a no-brainer that we just go with the price signal. There is no earthly case for thinking of a threshold, for wanting to keep emissions below some level, because frankly it doesn't make a damn bit of difference whether emissions are 5 or 15 gigatons, because the marginal there's more damage, but the marginal damage doesn't change at all dramatically. So this is, I think, my last slide. So how do my colleagues reach this conclusion? Well, it depends on a number of issues, and this is the last thing I want to say. This is a paper I'm working on because I think actually these slopes can be reversed. One thing is this: the analysis is done on a single year framing. So if we reduce emissions in 2010, what is the impact on damages? Well, if we reduce emissions in 2010 alone, sure, that's not going to be a big impact. What matters is the cumulative impact. If we reduce them in 2010 and then in 2011 we go back to what we were doing before, it ain't going to make much difference. But what policy is discussing is not a reduction in 2010. It's starting in 2010 and maintaining that reduction forevermore and adding further reductions, which are also maintained furthermore. It's not a one-year reduction. It's a permanent reduction, which ramps up, but these are permanent reductions. That makes a bigger difference. Also on the abatement cost side, the ramping up is not included in the analysis. There's a second thing is, I'm going to skip the second bullet for a minute. The damages, I think, are much larger, damn it, than the conventional assessment. Moreover, there's two key factors with the stock pollutant. How fast does the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere rise when we have emissions, say now? And secondly, so the derivative of the impact and the concentration in the atmosphere as a result of emissions today. And secondly, the effect of higher concentrations in the atmosphere on temperature and precipitation and all the other things, that derivative. Well, I think there's complacency because, so for CO2, these effects are on the order of 60 to 160 years. So the emissions, extra emissions now, or lower emissions now, have a significant change in concentrations and in temperatures 60 to 150 years from now. And then discounting kicks in because you have to say, well, how big, how. For other gases like methane, these things kick in 20, 30, 40 years. And that has not received as much attention in the atmosphere. And then combined with discounting, whether you think of a 40-year horizon or a 100-year horizon before an effect is felt, makes a huge difference. And then the second bullet is risk aversion, and it comes back, but it comes back in a way that's not in the paper you read. Turns out that the original Weitzman analysis 34 years ago makes a certain mathematical assumption which has the effect of eliminating, it uses a quadratic function for benefits and costs, and it turns out that has the effect of eliminating risk aversion. But if you, it implicitly assumes away risk aversion. But I've argued, as I did before, that risk aversion is a major factor here. and if you put risk aversion into this, that also changes the slopes. So this is, what I wanted to stress is they're economic issues, but they interact, first of all, with scientific issues about the facts of the damage, about the facts of the consequences, for example, symmetry or asymmetry of damage functions and so on. So the economics interacts with complacency or disagreement about what the scientific facts are. And also, on the policy side, the conventional wisdom about emission trading or taxes is based on a theoretical model of price signals alone radiating throughout the economy, driving behavior, when the empirical evidence is that that's not how things work, and that's not how emission trades have worked. What I've argued is the cap is the important part of cap and trade. The price signal is useful, but the cap is important. And so, at the end of the day, these are arguments about the science, and these are arguments about the empirics of behavior, which sort of interact with theoretical models. The theory is right only if the assumptions on which it rests are right. And that's always the Achilles heel of economists. Beautiful theory, but the assumptions may be flawed. Okay, thank you.